down, on prey, onward gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome to Eschatology Matters. I'm your host, Josh Howard. Eschatology Matters can be found on the Fight Laugh Feast network. We're also available on bonifacemedia.com, and we have an offer for you this morning as well. If you want to start reading the Puritans but you don't know where to begin, Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. So you can learn more about Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. And when you check out from that, use the code EMATTERS to get 10% off your order. EMATTERS for 10% off at Heritage Books. So I'm joined today by Pastor Chase Davis. Chase Davis is the host of the Foolproof Theology podcast, and he's one of my co-contributors over at Clear Truth Media. So Chase, thanks for your, I think, first time on Eschatology Matters.
That's correct. Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Chase, if somebody's not familiar with you, where are you at? What are you up to? Where can they follow what you're writing? I mentioned Clear Truth, which I think you've already put out a few through them, but what are you up to these days?
Yeah, so I'm a pastor out at the Well Church in Boulder, Colorado, a church we planted in 2011. It's been here for 13 years, about to move into a church building here in Boulder, which is totally an act of God because a church plant in Boulder hasn't done this in like 50 years here in our town in terms of buying its own building and moving into it and that kind of thing. So just a lot of obstacles. God has cleared the path for us to move in. I tweet. I get in trouble for those tweets sometimes, but I tweet at J. Chase Davis. You can follow me there. Like you said, Foolproof Theology. I've written at American Reformer, Clear Truth Media, and some other outlets as well. So doing that, and I've got a wife, 3 kids, and we have a business on the side, and I'm working on my PhD. But by working on it, I mean I've got a stack of books, and they just stare at me and haunt me. So
that is what PhD work is. It's just a big stack of books that makes you like wake up at 3 a.m. and have
Totally.
a panic attack. No, God bless your efforts there, man. Because yeah, the PhD slog is a whole lot of reading, whole lot of writing. It did key in on, though, because you mentioned this from the conference. So before I forget, I'm jumping ahead of myself. If anybody has not seen your address, and we'll try to link it in the show notes, it was from the New Christendom Conference out in Ogden, and you had a talk called, I think it was called "How to Kill a Movement." Was it the?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really encouraging. I encourage anybody that hasn't checked that out to do so. But you mentioned a few themes in there that I think really ties into this ongoing eschatological conversation. So first of all, just your take on sort of, because you were addressing this sort of new movement within Reformed circles, a lot of young guys, a lot of vigor, I would say a lot of eschatological hopefulness. I think it gets labeled as postmillennial a lot of times, but it's often not. A lot of times these are just optimistic amillennial guys or whatever that looks like. But I would say hopefulness is a key kind of definer of whatever this new thing is that's bubbling within a lot of Reformed circles. What's been your read on that? Because a lot of what you were not only trying to encourage, I think, but also warn against some of the ways to derail such a thing. You were kind of focusing on this movement. So what are you seeing in regards to that?
Yeah, so when it comes to kind of the hopeful stuff, if I could, I'd like to share some of my own story with it. Listeners to my show, people in my church know that some of my background, I used to say I was depressed. I don't know if I was actually depressed. I was just kind of an angsty kid that had a lot of questions. And so that led me to a lot of music and a lot of temperaments and personality traits that kind of developed a cynical spirit about life, suspicious, all this kind of stuff. And when 2020 hit, that kind of God just kind of put my face right in it in terms of, is this how you want to live? And so I was doing some reading on, I work with my best friend Matt at the Well, and he's naturally a much more like optimistic person. And I was like, this pessimistic spirit that I've had for, at that time, 34 years, like, is that producing the fruit that godly fruit that I want to see in my life? And I had to come to the conclusion that no, that kind of cynical disposition can be useful because you can kind of like pick things apart and look at things negatively and see liabilities and threats. At the same time, if that's kind of your predominant kind of mood, let's say, then the what often comes alongside that is not a godly disposition, one that's joyful and hopeful in the Lord. And so that was the first step in kind of like for me personally, just repenting of that. And that's a daily thing where it's like we'll get hard news or something like that. And I've got to remind myself of my joy in the Lord and hope in the Lord and look to the scriptures and look to Christ. And then out of that, like you said, there's kind of a broader, you know, kind of disposition amongst many evangelical men, I would say, Protestant evangelical men, that's more gregarious, more positive, more kind of like ready to go fight, believes in the triumph of the Lord. You know, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church where we always talked about this, that he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that everything belongs to him. These are biblical truths. But it was rarely pushed into the area of eschatology. It was rarely pushed into areas of like, it might have been a self-help talk in a sermon, like how to overcome your business, setback or how to overcome crisis in your marriage. But rarely was it talking about like Christ's lordship over the world and what that means for culture, what that means for nations, and then ultimately for me, I'm a pastor, so what it means for our own souls and our own formation. So you see this stuff out there, and I don't know if I admitted it for my talk or what, but for me, I've been an all-mill. I grew up in kind of Dispy world where I, left behind and I was in the orbit of DTS being in Dallas. And so kind of dispensationalism was the kind of just, culture in which I was raised. And then I came to an all-mill position in seminary. Honestly, at the time, and I think this is true for a lot of guys who adopt the all-mill position. It's not true for all of them, but for a lot of guys like me, the all-mill position is an easy out, because you don't have to pick its side, right? You can just say
Right.
like Christ is Lord, and then you don't have to like talk about maybe the harder edges of what that implies. Um, and it lets you interpret Revelation 20, 21, all that with more like, almost like some people interpret Genesis 1 and 2, where it's like it's symbolic and we don't are poetic and we don't really know what it means, but it's good, right? And that's how it started for me. But then as I studied the scriptures and I still remain Amil, to me, switching to Postmil, I think a lot of my friends are surprised to find I'm Amil because they see my public disposition now, they see my writing and my talking, they see what I'm encouraging other people towards, and they're like, well, that's Postmil. And I'm like, oh, it's not Postmil, it's just Christian. Like we're trying
Hmm.
to be Christian men who find joy in the Lord, trust in his providence, look forward to his second coming, and expect great things from God and pray big prayers. And so if that makes me post-mill, call me whatever you want. And then the other reason I didn't haven't switched is a lot of these terms, post-mill, all-mill, historic, pre-mill, and you can go down the rabbit trail. They're very much 20th century in my mind, at least, and you've done work on this more than I have probably, but in my mind, they're very much like 20th century constructions of eschatological conclusions. If you look in Augustine or Calvin or all these guys, they weren't using these categories. And in 20th century theology, a lot of times we like to get precise, we like to get detailed, we like to get into like this, not that. But oftentimes that's almost unhelpful, and it kind of makes people adopt a label without understanding either what the label means, like what it was for me, or create unnecessary divides where there doesn't need to be a divide, where we can hold scriptures in tension where they're supposed to be in tension. Not that they would ever contradict, but they should be held in tension. And so I haven't switched because I know that from my studies that when you change one piece of the puzzle, it's not just a puzzle. It kind of like it changes everything else. And so like systematic theology, right? If you look at any systematic theology, you can tell what doctrine is driving that boat based on where they put it in even the table of contents. You can see, look, this person puts ecclesiology. They're very big on ecclesiology. They kind of front load that, and they read all their other doctrines through that lens. And so, for young guys today, for Christians today, it's kind of like I just want to encourage a sober-mindedness towards either adopting labels or slogans are kind of fun, but just study the scriptures, trust your local church, read some good books, and let the Lord lead you into doctrinal development rather than feeling like you've got to like I'm this now and announce a big change or something. I just that's kind of my where I'm at doctrinally is I'm very much at ease with the Bible being the authority for all doctrinal matters, and whatever you want to call me based on that, Calvinist, you can call me Postmil, I'm Amil, but you can call me that, and I'm just kind of okay, yeah, that's fine. Just don't call me, I'm not, I'm definitely an Arminian. Like there's certain positions where I'm like very comfortable taking a stand, but eschatology is not one of those where I kind of make hard lines in the sand.
Right. Yeah, no, that's so number one, I totally sympathize with you saying, about the kind of natural inclination toward pessimism. I'm a glass half empty type guy. Like that's just my natural bent. So my wife and I make a great team because she's always like, look how beautiful that is. And I'm like, it's probably gonna catch on fire, like that, just kind of looking at life in that way. I think it's one thing that oftentimes optimism, not just eschatological optimism, but a biblical optimism, like a thoroughgoing biblical optimism, it gets discounted as sort of dismissive. And I don't think that's the case for a lot of us. I think for a lot of us, this isn't me trying to like tout optimistic eschatology. It's just saying that a general optimism is the fruit of a Christian life. It's a fruit of sanctification. So for a lot of us, when we describe ourselves as optimistic, that's not a pat on the back. That's more of a self-own that like God is transforming me to see things a bit differently. But you'd mentioned when you're talking about the how to kill a movement thing. Well, no, wait. Let me bring up one more thing too before we move on. The categories. So we had toyed around with the idea of kind of divvying up some of these eschatological categories, and we abandoned the project because specifically what you just mentioned. You read, especially some of the older guys. You read, Kuyper, and you put him in an Amel box, but you read some of Kuyper's pro reggae, and you're like, okay, this is thoroughgoing postmillennialism. You read the old Princeton crowd, thoroughgoing postmill, and yet some of those categories, I agree, are not. They're not helpful. I mean, sometimes they're unavoidable, but sometimes
Yeah.
they're more confusing than they're actually helpful, I think, within Christian discourse. But one thing that I have noticed that a lot of people seem to latch onto, again, looking to that your talk, looking to this kind of new reformed movement, whatever that is, there's an ability to laugh, I guess, in the face of danger or threat. And I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that because you mentioned, you mentioned one of the Chesterton quotes about the need to be able to laugh, not only at yourself, but just in general, and the absence of laughter being actually a sign of death. And you were applying that specifically toward movements, but walk me into that because I see that from a lot of especially young guys who are looking at a pretty daunting landscape, 2020, through 2024, but it's promoting a sense of laughter and joy in the midst of that struggle. Walk us into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, I approach a lot of stuff through a lens of a pastor. And so when I imagine the great man, the disciples that we want to be, when I imagine Christ's disposition, obviously Christ wept. He had an emotional life, which was completely holy. I look at the biblical text and I imagine the type of great men we want to make, and in terms of our discipleship, and I'm like, what kind of great men do we want to make? Do we want to make a bunch of dour, kind of like, oh, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. We lose down here. Is that the kind of disposition that we want to make, first of all? No. Okay. Well, what does the Bible, maybe the Bible does teach us we should lose down here. I don't think it does. But if we just look at the Bible, what kind of disciples, what do we see often in Scripture? And we see a consistent theme of hope in the Lord. I mean, this is how God moved in my life, even in my teens, when I was reading Joshua, be strong and courageous. These kind of dispositions, these commitments, you might say, to be strong and courageous, even in the face of being outnumbered, being overcome, being overwhelmed, remaining in kind of that relationship with the Lord and the church, such that you can laugh in the face of danger. Obviously, not like a crazy person necessarily, but it will look crazy sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of fighting spirit that a lot of us didn't get from Christianity. We're kind of taught either in the church or through books or podcasts or thinkers, whoever it may be, that's boastful or prideful or arrogant. It's like, actually, no, like we're not boasting in our own strength, we're boasting in the Lord. And having that kind of undaunting spirit about us, that fighting spirit about us is very biblical. Of course, we could parse out different vulnerabilities and liabilities that come with that. Maybe you like to fight too much, you're pugnacious or something like that. And obviously we're not bloodthirsty people, but we fight for what's behind us. And so having that ability to laugh at oneself, this is something that I've my friendship with Matt and others, it's always been a marker of a healthy friendship for me when somebody who has strong convictions is still able to like understand that they're still human It's a
Yeah.
very creaturely disposition to not take yourself too seriously, to where you're just like, hey, yeah, I've got some quirks, some idiosyncrasies. If people make a joke, if they're my friends and they make a joke, then I try to laugh along with them. I'm not, and that comes from a deep place of satisfaction and security in the Lord, knowing that I don't know everything. I can be at ease with who I am, where I am at the time I am, and not have to unnecessarily project some kind of fake, like I'm perfect or I've got it all figured out. It's actually comes springs from a place of humility and being dependent on the Lord. That's what allows us to then go, yeah, like I don't have it all figured out, but I do have convictions and I'll fight you on them. But even in my fighting, I'm not gonna like assume, that I'm God.
Right.
Which is what, unfortunately, when you get a big platform and that kind of thing, a lot of people do treat you as if you're like this all-knowing person. Oh, what do you think about this? What do you, not that I'm that person, but I just saw that with a lot of the Young Restless Reformed, where it was like, oh, we got to go read the latest TGC article on this topic because they're kind of all-knowing. And I don't know if they meant to do that. I actually don't think they did, but I think a lot of us were kind of caught up in that. And
Mm.
so that was kind of a warning that I wanted to offer, was like, hey, like, it's okay to laugh at yourself. And now we see TGC doesn't seem to be able to laugh at itself. It'd be one thing if people treated them that way, and they could be like, yeah, we kind of, we messed up a few times. We're definitely not perfect. There are other great thinkers out there. But that's not the typical disposition you get from kind of these big Eva, going on cruises to sell their latest book kind of guys. There's it seems to be a lack of humility and a lack of ability to laugh at oneself, unless it comes from the enemy, and then they're like debase themselves before their enemy,
Mm.
which is quite unfortunate and not something you want to do. So that's kind of where that came from.
Yeah. It's funny how we talk about hero worship so often in the Christian church, and yet we still seem to entertain it so frequently. But when I was hearing your talk and I was thinking about that ability to laugh, um, I think what it belies is maybe it's not always eschatology driving this thing. I don't really care if the eschatology comes first or second, but I think there's a teleological component to this. There's a telos.
Yep.
There's a sense of story, even if you don't have your eschatology, fully sussed out, and you use that curse word of panmillennialism or something like that. There's still like there's a telos, right? That's the only thing that I can think of that could explain how has such a robust, hopeful Christianity seemed to flourish in the last 4 years? Because it's not the environment. That's
No.
usually how these things are kind of set up. It's like, well, the world wars came along, so optimistic eschatology fell away. That's the reverse of what we're seeing here. Here it's there's an encouragement, and I think it's from that telos, that hopefulness. What you brought up, I don't think you used the word telos, but it was right there in what you're describing with the movement. What's different about that than what's come before? Because I'm with you. I think we're from the probably same generation. I'm 40. So, growing up in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of telos. And if there was a telos, oftentimes what you heard from people, it was a destruction telos. It was,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's going to happen, but there's going to be flames everywhere and it's going to be bad. What have you seen with that, Chase?
Yeah, I mean, just like with the last, especially, so if we kind of identify in the last 4 years, this weird paradox that the world seems to be going crazier and crazier and spinning out of control, and things seem to be crumbling, which I'm laughing about even as I say it, because like the fruit of the world is just playing out over and over again. I mean, you've got at the Democratic National Convention, they have a statue of a, what is an IUD? I
Yes.
uh and it's like these are just the pagan gods, man. Like these are, it's all on full display. And so that gives you a sense of, yeah, like this is insane. And what I was always taught is that like Christ is Lord and he wins in the end. And if we know that we win in the end, with Christ, he is our victor, then we should have a type of temperament that is not annihilationist or, total destruction of the earth. We should have a sober-minded biblical hopefulness in his eventual and current, I would say current, not just eventual, but current rule and reign, and the eventual, like telos, like you mentioned, of that rule and reign. What will the world look like when he does return? And when he does wipe away every tear, what will that look like? And if we do pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, then we should be actively trying to cultivate not only in our own lives and our churches, but in the world, that kind of uh, attitude, that disposition of No, Christ is Lord. He's good always. He's always faithful, and his providence goes before us everywhere. He is our shield. He is our defender. He is our rock. Like, yeah. So in the midst of it's that paradox of, yeah, things don't seem to be going well. I'm trying to imagine a scenario where I'd be like, my hope would be naive or unbiblical. And I'm like, I can't, there's never a time in a Christian's life where you can say, I shouldn't hope in the Lord.
Right.
Based on the circumstances on the ground, I shouldn't hope in the Lord. No, we should always hope in the Lord. And that should lead us to a place of like, man, I don't know how this is going to work out, but like, I'm trusting the Lord and moving forward, and all I can do is the next step that He's given me to do and accomplish and do my best by Him, knowing that I'm a mixed bag of emotions and I'm a creature and a human man, and I'm not perfect. And yet that should produce in us kind of an undaunted, kind of positive. And that's what so you mentioned your marriage. Um, I thought I married a woman like you married, and it turns out I didn't. We both have a cynical disposition. Thankfully, we're surrounded by friends who are much more positive than us. But one of the books, I won't recommend it because it's a secular book, but one of the books I was reading in 2020 was actually a secular psychologist on the power of optimism. And why was I doing that? Because I was kind of re-examining like what have I believed about these matters, and I was, in church leadership, this plays out too. Church planting. Rarely does anyone want to follow a guy that gets up on in the pulpit and goes, "Yeah, things are not going well, and I don't know how this is going to work out." That's not a biblical leader. A biblical leader is somebody who trusts in the Lord, leads God's people, and gives them a vision that's from the Lord, and then helps them accomplish that task, that responsibility. But this is even proved out in secular literature, just from psychologists. They say, yeah, it's actually better to be like, it would be almost better to be the naive optimist, if there is such a thing, than the one who's always saying, that's going to light on fire, things are going to go bad. Like just from a fruitful life standpoint, a health standpoint, it's better to have that disposition.
Right.
And so, yeah, that kind of coming back to what you were talking about, I just think that as the world gets more insane, it provides more opportunities for God to kind of show off and for us to trust in His promises. And that's always a wise thing to do, especially when things look like they do right now, which is like, dude, I don't know what's going on. Like, are we in a cold civil war? Who's going to be the political leader? What's happening with schools? What's happening with culture? We have resurgent paganism. We've got people who hate Christians, like openly hate Christians. This is not new to us in Boulder, but for a lot of people it is. And so, what are we to do with that? We should hope in the Lord. We should trust in Him. We should proclaim the gospel everywhere we can. And so, yeah, that's kind of where all that comes from.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, you mentioned the towering IUD statue, and just how comedic that whole picture is. I think for a lot of Christians, it's that we didn't want to fight the battles we're being given right now. That yeah, I'm sure that's not like just a blanket statement that covers everybody's reaction, but I think for a lot of us as Christians, it's just like this wasn't the place or the time or the thing that we wanted to be in a fight against. You mentioned in your talk that scene with Frodo and Gandalf and him saying, oh, if it wasn't a time like this, and Gandalf saying something, I'm butchering the quote, but something to the effect of like, well, this is the time that was given and we were to do what we're supposed to do with it. That's a biblical theme though.
Totally.
Right. I mean, Tolkien would have recognized that. That's a biblical theme of you fight the battle to which you've been called. I think for a lot of us, we weren't expecting 12-foot IUD statues or Baphomet statues in Iowa state capitals. Like those weren't the battles we were planning to fight. Certainly not here. I think maybe for a lot of us over the years that we were very convinced there was going to be battles, but they were going to be maybe convenient battles of our own choosing that are going to be in a foreign country or something like that. And when I say battle, obviously I'm talking spiritual
I know
battles,
what you mean. Yeah.
conflicts. Yeah. Have to
Uh,
clarify that for the algorithm, but
yeah. Well, I think with that, so I kind of missed that part of your question earlier was like, what were we raised in? And it actually is an interesting kind of like uh, thought experiment and analysis because like being raised Southern Baptist, I remember when we like our family boycotted Disney with our Southern Baptist church, right? Because they had some kind of gay parade or something at Disney, and which was totally fair and totally like, good on them for seeing that back in the 90s for what it was. As a little kid, I didn't get it. Um, but I think the battles like back then uh, like the predominant mood in from Christian teachers, Christian leaders was culture warrior is bad. We live in a democracy. We live in pluralism. Pluralism is a predominant theme if you look back kind of in the way we approach politics and culture and this kind of thing. And so anything that would upset that kind of pluralistic arrangement is seen as like uncouth or like you're not going to be like widely celebrated, you might say. And then alongside that, with the teaching, you actually get kind of a reinforcement of a principled pluralism in the public square. And so the idea of you going out and confronting Disney or whatever it was back then, feminism, let's say, was seen as very disruptive to our common life together as Americans. And
Hmm.
so the church back then, I think, was honestly a little bit asleep, just broadly speaking. There were some, like I always, the Christian Reconstructionists are a fascinating movement to me because they were seeing a lot of things and they were doing some really good work back in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, there were some personality things that really made that movement pretty terrible to be part of for some people, but like they had some pretty prescient awareness of what was going on. And so I will like if somebody goes, you should read Rushdoony on that. I'm like, yeah, I will read Rushdoony on that because he was seeing things that a lot of evangelicalism in the 80s and 90s, whether it's you're talking seeker sensitive or even conservative evangelicalism, that they were kind of asleep at the wheel on.
Yeah.
They had adopted this, whether you want to call it a post-war consensus or principal pluralism or whatever it is, they had adopted that framework in terms of Christ's lordship. And so they had adopted a lot of propaganda from the kind of American elite regarding separation of church and state or whatever it might be. And so they were kind of very, very reticent, very hesitant to get involved in that stuff because socially it was seen as a big negative. And now what we see with a lot of young people is that you can make a lot of friends real fast by going down and tearing down a statue of Satan in the Iowa State Capitol, right? Who knows how powerful these friends are? I mean, these are many times they're non-friends. And so they could be anywhere from a 19-year-old to a 50-year-old with a PhD living in a different country. We don't know.
Right.
But you can find a lot of good, especially with the rise of the internet, you can find a lot of friendship by taking bold, courageous stands for Christ. Whereas back then, you were kind of on an island. And it was unclear where the different movements were. Now with the rise of the internet, it's much easier, I think, to get into some of those circles and those movements.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up the Watchmen too. That's been one I've been kicking around this idea for a while, just because, the whole Ezekiel imagery of the Watchman on the wall. We know it's incumbent on the Watchmen to call out dangers that are coming against the city. That's
Yep.
that's pretty clear. You mentioned in your talk artillery cannons that were tinkered with but never fired. I thought that was
Yeah.
spot on. So you've got the Watchman. You've also got the admonition to the Watchman that if he fails to call out the enemy, and then he comes inside the city, their blood is on his hands. That sort of thing. The idea I've been kicking around is to what effect is uh, the impotent watchman? To what extent is he God's judgment upon the people?
Mm,
So if the city is apathetic and unfaithful and inculcating sins within its own body, to what extent does God put incompetent watchmen on the walls specifically as a judgment against the people? It's been an idea that I've been percolating with because I think, and I don't hear this from you, Chase, but I think for me it's really easy to point at certain evangelical leaders or institutions when a lot of times the finger is back at us as well.
totally.
Yes, they failed, and so did we in certain regards. Um, yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that one before I jump into this next point, but
No, it's an analogy I was challenging seminary professors that I had known even in 2020 I was challenging them on because I was like, you guys tout all this ammunition you've got, these arguments about the different arguments for God, the doctrine of God. You have access to ETS publications, books, you have book deals, you have institutions, you have seminaries. Where are you? I
yeah,
mean, they've got transgenderism, we've got racism, we've got all these things, and you're not dispensing any ammo. You're just kind of like in your ivory tower. But I do think there's something to that. I mean, we know that even if we were to speak politically, our political leaders are often an indictment on the very people. Like they
right.
they come from the people, typically, and so Yeah, it's very much so. And I've taught from Micah 7 on this, where the watchmen didn't watch the city, and the watchmen, like you said, they will receive judgment, actually the death penalty, if they fail to warn of attack. And so the watchmen seem to have gone silent in 2020, which was incredibly disheartening. But I also think you're right. Like the you had to get to the point, and this is where I'm, again, being a pastor. There's a reality of agency in our own life. Let's say we notice that these watchmen, um, well, let's just go institutionally, like Christianity today. Let's say they have totally abandoned their post and they're actually opening the gate to the enemy.
Mhm.
Yes, that should unnerve us. That should be disturbing to us. But at the end of the day, as a Christian, you have to say, what am I going to do about it?
Right.
How am I going to take responsibility? You have agency. You are not just dependent on these guys who are silent, or even giving arms to the enemy. You have a responsibility for the Lord for you. And so
Yep.
what have you done? And so that then leads you to personal repentance, either where you've failed to protect your family against worldly ideologies, where you've failed to protect your church, or given your church bad resources, and that's something we've had to own. And so it leads you to a place of personal responsibility when you can repent and look at your own life rather than blaming outside forces, while still acknowledging that outside forces exist and watchmen exist for a reason. That's a position, just like the magistrate is a servant of the Lord. That's still, they have their own responsibility and they have blood on their hands, so to speak, in terms of their agency and their positional power. But especially as a pastor, I was like, I have a responsibility here. My
Yep.
people, the sheep, are suffering. And I need to equip them biblically. I need to feed them the word so that they can think clearly and they can rest in the Lord as they go into workplaces that are teaching them to hate their own skin color, as they go into workplaces that are teaching them about transgenderism, all this kind of stuff. I have a duty before the Lord. So in my, whatever my, um, you know, land that He's given me to till, uh, that is mine. I
Yep.
can't control, what kind of chemicals they're putting in the air, let's say. I can't control other outside forces, but I have agency and I can control what I have a responsibility over, at least at this time. And so that's kind of where that came from for me.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's a pastorally tremendously comforting thing for Christians because if we get into I used to say Fox News mode. It's really any news mode, right? Like there's things that are far beyond my control that are deeply concerning, but they're far beyond my control. So like I pray for those things and I do what I can, but there's like actual things that are actionable for me within
Totally.
my realm of influence. So speaking of that, because I was trying to think like applying this at a pastoral level. I'm curious how you would encourage Christians in our day and age to how should we be praying and laboring right now? And this is what I wanted to set it up with. Through the years, I think you and I probably have some shared experiences with this. Christians talk about revival or the need for revival quite frequently, right? Whether it's, not just tent revivals or something formalized, but a true societal revival, a revival among God's people that spills out into the culture around, that sort of thing. Two things I've been considering when it comes to revival. Number one, I'm not so sure we want revival if it comes through the means that revival often comes. You know what I mean? Like the steps that lead up to the revival, we want to skip those, get to the end.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not so sure we all the time understand what we're praying for when we say revival. So that's the
yeah.
first thing. But then the second thing would be, what should that revival look like? And that's where I'm keying in on something you brought up. It hit home so much for me. You brought up the kind of squishy megachurch in your town. They've been squishy and unfaithful and unbiblical for years. They've just been, but now they start to retrieve true biblical reformed doctrines and they start to experience revival and they start to bow the knee to Christ and submit to His word. And you see the church just blow up and they're doing all the same things you've been doing for years, but nothing really happens in your context. And your point was about bitterness, or maybe even envy or covetousness. And that just hit home to me because I was like, that's what revival would look like. But
Yeah.
again, I'm not so sure that's the way we're thinking when we're thinking revival. Walk me into that. How do you encourage your people to pray toward revival and not only the steps you might need to go through to get there, but also what God might bring through that true revival?
Yeah, so it stems from a deep place of like humility and like knowing that you're just one kind of like person and one church in God's plan of redemption. And so whether, I mean, this has always been our prayer in Boulder. However, you know, foolish it was. I don't think it was a foolish prayer necessarily, but like however like naive, like when we moved here, it was like, yeah, like we know we're not moving here like, oh, now we're here, everything's better. We're moving here like, no, like what did our reformers do when there was Reformation happening? They were killed. Like they were killed. And so the prayer has always been like, if it would be better that I not be here so that more people could come to know the Lord, that's fine with me. Like it's not about me, a platform or anything like that. So it stems from a deep place of like, we just want God's name to be made great in the world, by whatever means He chooses to use, whether it's me or somebody else. My life is His, and so yeah, with revival, oftentimes what it's going to look like is not just like a bunch of people singing praise and worship songs, lifting their hands and crying. I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but that's often the fruit back, if you look at the Old Testament, of the reading of God's word, deep conviction, tearing down of idolatry, turning away from sins. And then comes the dancing, the worship, the celebration, the renewal of the covenant, that kind of thing. And so in our land, yeah, I really do not try like when I get either boomers or other people that are kind of the Jesus movement of the 70s. And in America, we have a deep history of revivalism that's very much like part of our evangelical ecosystem.
Yep.
And so any Christian that that maybe hungers for that, I do not try to dump on that parade at all, because in that is a good desire, is a it's a good thing to want that. But of course we have to explain like what that is actually going to take. It's going to take a rejection of worldly ideologies, not only out there but in here, like in our own lives. It's going to take reformation and repentance in our own churches, and tearing down like offices that people currently have that they shouldn't have in the church. Or it's going to take repenting of even systems we've built into the church, ways of operating as a church that we shouldn't do anymore based on biblical norms and standards. And
Right.
so it's going to look like turning back to the scriptures, repenting, tearing down idolatry in our own lives. And this is where a guy like Jordan Peterson can be helpful. Like one of his quips about, who are you to think you can go change the world if you can't even change your own life?
Mhm.
And that's a biblical principle. Like we should do that. Of course, we're people in process of sanctification. So I'm not, this isn't a pietistic encouragement by any means. It's a biblical encouragement. The pietists, of course, get it wrong when they say you shouldn't act or you shouldn't do anything until all your ducks are in a row personally in your holiness. I think that is a misstep. And I don't think that's faithful to the biblical text at all, especially if you read a book like Judges. God uses a bunch of people who have a bunch of problems to do really great things and accomplish His will in the world. And at the same time, God is teaching them a lesson even in their sanctification as they accomplish God's will. And so we should have it's like I said, it stems from a place of deep humility where it's like, yeah, like I need to take responsibility for what I've done, for where my affections have been wrong, where my ideas have been wrong, where my behaviors have been wrong, and then that will produce fruit in the world. And like you mentioned, and it's something that I have to check in my own heart. I'm a big believer in the church, whether however, there's some churches that are so deviant where it's like, yeah, they should just go away like yesterday. They are obviously apostate. But there's a lot of churches who are either compromised or not clear, or they do need needs to be some repentance there in terms of like, let's say, egalitarianism. Um, there needs to be repentance there. But with that disposition, that Christian virtue of humility and trusting the Lord, I look back at my own life and ministry and I'm like, how deeply confused when I was 20,
Oh yeah.
about different doctrines, about different practices. And look at where I am now, not to boast of myself, but to boast in the Lord, because I want to see people grow in holiness and righteousness. And so with other churches that are either mega churches or just a different church, I try to have a patient spirit because God has been patient with me. That doesn't mean I don't call balls and strikes. They know where I stand on matters. It doesn't mean I don't, try to encourage them towards righteousness and biblical fidelity in their ministry. But it does mean that as God has been patient with me, I can be patient with others because they have their own pressures and story and all that stuff that I don't necessarily know about.
Right.
I don't have all the answers, but I do have the Bible, and I do have deep convictions about various doctrines in the Bible, and I can encourage others with those or challenge others with those while maintaining a joyful kind of like, this is where we're at. This is what I'm seeing. You may not be there yet. Would be happy to talk more about it if you ever want to. So
Yeah. Yeah, joy in the midst of struggle. I think it's a valuable takeaway for Christians in 2024. You were describing your situation in Boulder, Colorado, hard soil to till, so to speak. But there's a joy in the labor. I think that's the message for Christians, is that whether you're mill or post-mill, which are clearly the only two biblical categories we're working with. If you're now, whatever your eschatology, like honestly, wherever you land on that there is a joy in the midst of the struggle with what we are confronted with in this world. I think that's a great takeaway for Christians, maybe in 2024. Chase, it's been fun. Where can people, if you'd remind them, wherever you're most active, I'll just leave that up to you, that people can follow.
yes, yeah, most active probably on Twitter, at J Chase Davis. You can follow me there, and then most of my content I do weekly episodes or try to weekly episodes. They're typically interviews on my podcast at Foolproof Theology, FULL Proof Theology. You can find that anywhere podcasts are found. You can find it on YouTube. Most people listen on podcasts, and I try to have great guests. I've had everyone from Oz Guinness to John Frame to random anon people on Twitter. Just things that pique my curiosity, maybe pique other people's curiosity. And so, yeah, Foolproof Theology, you can find me over there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chase. Appreciate you, brother.
Yeah, thank you.
Seated here at my right hand, the